Hello, and welcome back to the podcast of Wednesday's Child. I'm delighted to share this episode with you today. We have a guest that will be very familiar to you, Abi Reynolds, who's been a long-time specialist in perinatal health and eating disorders in that sort of perinatal period. So, welcome back, Abi. It's been a while. How are you?
I'm all right, thank you. Yeah, and I suppose it's very generous of you to call me a specialist, but I would like to clarify that I have no kind of clinical qualifications. It's very much to
Definitely from our perspective, lived
just lived
experience,
experience.
as we always say, lived experience kind of leapfrogs above so many other aspects of it, explaining how specialist someone might be. So I really, and I know we'll get into a little bit of your story when we
Sure.
chat further into this episode, but I think many people who have heard you speak before will certainly say that you are a specialist in your subject. So
Thank
that's
you.
for sure. Our other guest today is Chantelle Ecob, who is a clinical psychologist, trainee clinical psychologist at the University of Manchester. And she's joining us today because she's going to talk about a very important piece of research, which is all about eating disorders in the postpartum period. Hence why we have this virtuous circle of Abi, myself, and Chantelle all to discuss this topic in greater detail today. So, Chantelle, thanks for joining us. How are you?
I'm okay, thank you. Thank you for having me and looking forward to talking to you about my research.
Well, yeah, I really want to get stuck straight into this. So tell me where this came from, why you felt the research was necessary, and kind of what you knew previously that had led you to this point.
So I think whilst planning my research, I was aware I wanted to focus on the perinatal period, specifically mental health difficulties. And whilst doing some research and reading into the area and looking for sort of gaps in the knowledge, this whole sort of world of eating disorders kind of jumped out at me as very interesting, very understudied, and very important. I think the research is very limited in the area of eating disorders during pregnancy and postpartum. And also quite inconsistent. The research doesn't quite add up, and also there's no guidelines, there's no formal guidelines for healthcare professionals working with women with eating disorders during the perinatal period. And then from sort of going on Twitter and talking to people with lived experience, it became even more clear that this is a really difficult time for women. So I thought, wow, this is really important, and I think there needs to be more done in the area.
So clearly that came as quite a shock to you to realise that there were no rules, there wasn't a great deal of research. But of course, Abi, I'm sure you're sitting there listening to that and thinking, no surprise at all.
Well, no, exactly. Yeah, so I developed an eating disorder after my first son was born, almost 9 years ago now, and I hadn't, previously had any issues with food or exercise or anything before. So it really came out of seemingly nowhere. And I think although, there are so many factors and causes and triggers, for eating disorders, one element of it was certainly kind of feeling quite, I suppose, vulnerable or low about, how I looked and felt having become a mum. And I think the narrative, around women needing to bounce back after giving birth or um, kind of getting back in shape and buggy boot camp and all that kind of stuff, that sort of subtle and not so subtle implication that weight loss should, be a priority even in those kind of blurry early days of motherhood. I think certainly subconsciously added to, I suppose, a bundle of other things which were also, causing me to feel quite kind of stressed and lonely and isolated. So it was a bit of a perfect storm in my case, but certainly I didn't really know what was happening to me. I couldn't believe that, as a 30-year-old, new mum, I was suddenly sort of gripped by these behaviors and compulsions and kind of values almost that seemed so alien but so consuming. And having reached out at various points along my journey, it very quickly became apparent that not only, was there not much in the way of kind of really relevant specialist support available, but actually even kind of, asking for support or flagging up problems was just roundly dismissed, and that there are so many unhelpful and outdated stereotypes and kind of misunderstandings around eating disorders generally that, I think, let alone getting the right specialist support, I think, even having somebody acknowledge or believe or validate what you're saying in your experience was impossible to come by, for several years. And so I think I was well aware during my journey that I was pretty alone in it, and I felt very much like I was the only person who'd kind of been experiencing an eating disorder in the postnatal period, because I couldn't find anything about it. There was nothing online, and there were no support groups aimed for me, and actually that really exacerbated the problem, because actually you then think, well, what's wrong with me? There's something wrong with me. No other mother is kind of, I suppose, selfishly putting these rituals or compulsions ahead of their children, their family. And the inner critic when you have an eating disorder is pretty loud at the best of times. Excuse me. And then later on, when I became pregnant with my second child, the eating disorder really took hold at a whole new level. And I think I really struggled to access support right through my pregnancy, up until I think I was 8 months pregnant, when finally someone believed me and helped me. And at that point knew I was really serious and unwell, and my baby was at risk. So yeah, that's a very long-winded way of saying, yeah, this is a gap that needs some attention.
So Chantelle, you obviously you made a point of finding people like Abi to talk to so you could hear these experiences. How did that leave you feeling? And were you sort of frustrated, surprised? What was it that you took from those kind of stories that you were hearing?
I think, yeah, I was surprised. I think when you think about, eating disorders and pregnancy, it does almost seem quite obvious. There's lots of weight changes, body shape changes. It would make sense that these difficulties would worsen during that period, but there's no one sort of screaming about it. Or I think I was just shocked at the lack of research in the area. And I think Abi raised a really important sort of point, that the research there is does show that this is a really crucial time for women who have already had an eating disorder. Those that currently have an eating disorder, it can get worse. Those who are sort of considered in recovery or remission, it can trigger that to worsen again and relapse. Or even people who have not struggled before, it can sort of trigger these new behaviours and cognitions, like you said. So we're not just looking at sort of one specific group here. We're thinking about all women to experience pregnancy. This is a risk factor for.
Yeah, I think, as you say, like the relapse rate, it's something like, because I think one study that I'd looked at said, that 16% of pregnant women will have had an eating disorder at some point, which is a huge number when of pregnant women experiencing that. And actually the postpartum relapse rate is 50%. And you sort of think, well, how is there not more research on this? And, without wanting to be too down on patriarchy, you think if this was an issue that mainly affected males, a 50% relapse rate would not be seen as acceptable or kind of not worthy of action.
So tell me what form the research has taken, Chantelle, and where you are with it now.
So our research is focusing specifically on the postpartum period, so the weeks and months directly after a woman gives birth. That's because the current research does show that pregnancy can provide a lot of protective factors for women with eating disorders. So, you know, your body changes function, you're eating to provide nutrition for the growing baby. There's sort of a new context to any weight gain or body changes. And some women, not all women, can show improvement in symptoms during that pregnancy time. I think, however, that postpartum period is such a risk area because you lose all those protective factors. You know, you're no longer looking after your own body for that baby. There's no sort of added context to that weight gain or body shape change. That woman.
So what you're saying there is, sorry to interrupt, but what you're saying there is some of the kind of anecdotal stories that we've heard from some people is that actually during their pregnancy, it has become, perhaps for people that had previously had issues with an eating disorder, in some cases, a woman has perhaps felt this is the time when I must nurture my body. I don't feel ashamed of my growing body. I'm more accepting of my changing shape, however big that might be during this period. I'm doing what's necessary for me and for my baby. So as such, it begins to feel as if the symptoms of an eating disorder and those kind of cognitions are lessened to some degree during the 9 months of the actual incubation of baby.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, not for all women. There are a lot of women who continue with those behaviours and struggle to, I guess, relinquish them. But there is some protective factors during that time. But postpartum, you know, a lot of those protective factors disappear. There's a lot more stress. There's obviously sleep deprivation from having a newborn. A lot of women find that they become a bit more socially isolated. So people back away a bit to give them some space with the baby. Partner might return back to work if there is a partner. And I think that provides, like, I guess, a big risk for women to relapse.
And again, on Wednesday's Child, we often talk about what is your identity and what validates you as a human. And for some women, that's going to be, hold on a second, I'm no longer that career woman that I was, or I'm no longer that busy social butterfly that was doing all these things because I'm the only one with the baby now, and I'm not part of this group, and I'm not part of my working world. And as you say, maybe the partner's gone back to work. So there are lots of factors. And I suppose also in recent years, we could throw in how it might have been feeling for people who became pregnant and experienced early motherhood during COVID. I mean, that would have been even worse. And I know, Abi, you kind of had aspects of that, didn't you, as a
yeah,
mom?
so my little boy was, I think, 8 months when the first lockdown hit, but actually we'd sort of been living in our own kind of lockdown before that because I was really poorly, and it was just a very blurry, kind of lonely first few months where I was really entrenched in the eating disorder, whilst also trying to navigate looking after a newborn and my 5-year old. Thankfully, I have a really loving, supportive partner, but my baby and I were admitted to the mother and baby unit in the January of 2020, and I mean, that's almost another kind of topic for discussion, how, that's, full of postpartum women, and actually none of the mental health nurses on the ward by their own admission had ever worked with anybody with an eating disorder or really knew anything about it. So having kind of had a really quite challenging time in there, we were discharged and then lockdown started 3 weeks later, and suddenly, any kind of face-to-face support or anything I'd been having was whipped away. I was having to homeschool my 5-year-old, whilst also obviously looking after my little one and trying to recover from a really vicious eating disorder. So definitely COVID, I appreciate it's not the same. My husband was able to be at my scans, and he was able to be at the birth. And I know that, for thousands of women, they had to do all of that alone. And I can't imagine, how distressing that must have been, given how hard it was even just for me. Yeah, when for the majority of the newborn stage, I was, supported. I've slightly forgotten what the question was. I'm so sorry.
No, I was just saying that I think, you know, certainly for women that have
Yeah, the
that kind of
COVID.
postpartum
Yeah, and
phase
I think that will have really. I think there are a lot of women who either, you know, had or had an eating disorder at the time, or historically had one, for whom COVID will have really exacerbated their disorder, or kind of reawaken it, reawoken it. And yeah, I think we're probably only really beginning to see just quite the extent of the damage the lockdowns did.
And are you seeing that, Chantelle, in terms of the work that you've done so far and what you've gathered? Have you seen that?
I mean, we're at very early stages of gathering data so far. I think it's a really interesting point to look at the impact of COVID. I guess we need like a starting point, really, a baseline for how women are generally impacted, and then we can compare that with specifically women who experienced it during COVID. But I would expect there to be some really interesting findings. I think specifically postpartum, a lot of the focus from healthcare professionals shifts to the baby rather than during pregnancy. It's like mum and baby. Postpartum, I guess there's a lot of weighing the baby, how's the baby doing, rather than how's mum doing.
And I think even, you know, not just with health professionals, but even kind of friends and family, you know, they come round and they say, oh, hi, and they, you know, oh, let me see the baby. And actually, you just, actually, you know, it may be that they could slightly more usefully make you a sandwich as well. Or, you know, I think the focus does shift. And so I think it is easier for maybe unhelpful behaviors, or kind of unhealthy thinking patterns to kind of resurface and not necessarily be on the radar of everyone around. And I think the other big thing, I'm really interested, Chantelle, whether you're looking into this in your research at all, is breastfeeding as a topic. And you know, I think for me, breastfeeding was a huge piece of, or a huge challenge, and a hugely emotive aspect of navigating the postpartum period with an eating disorder. I think it's a hugely emotive aspect of most women's, you know, postnatal period, you know, whether they do or they don't, or they can or they can't, or they mix feed or they formula feed. And it's such a sort of heated topic anyway. But my experience of that was, you know, that definitely had a real impact in terms of my eating disorder. You know, because I didn't have an eating disorder when my first son was born. It was, you know, once he was maybe a year that it really kicked in. And so I breastfed him no problem, and I'd sort of always wanted to, and I was really lucky and could. And you know, I was really pleased that I could kind of do that for him and for me. And then I think one of the issues that was raised when I was diagnosed in the life with anorexia in the later stages of my second pregnancy was, well, you probably won't be able to breastfeed because you're not taking on adequate nutrition, you know, even for yourself. So how are you going to, you know, produce enough milk? And I that had a huge impact on me, because I felt so much shame already about having used eating disorder behaviors during pregnancy. You know, it's another level of shame when you kind of know you're potentially harming your unborn child as well as yourself, that to then suddenly have someone say to me, oh, you probably won't be able to breastfeed. I just thought, well, hang on, I did that for my older son, and now not only have I put my second son at risk, I'm also potentially depriving him of that possibility. And you know, further down the line, and you know, knowing all that I know now, to be honest, I think while breastfeeding has its benefits, I don't think it is the be all and end all. And you know, I can totally rationally reflect on the fact that, you know, like my boys at the age they are now, probably neither know or care how they were fed. I remember my husband saying to me, "I've no idea if my mum breastfed me, no idea." And I'm happy and healthy, and but at the time, and especially because there is such a biased narrative about it within the healthcare system, it felt like my life depended on it. It felt like the most important thing in the world, that if I couldn't breastfeed my little boy, that I was already feeling so low on myself and so ashamed, and experiencing really dark, intrusive thoughts, that actually that suddenly became this absolute obsession in my mind, that I had to be able to do this. I had to. And in a way, that was one kind of protective motivational factor. It's like, well, I have to eat enough so that I can produce milk. But then I did produce milk, and I was so relieved, the first time that he managed to breastfeed, and I thought, oh my goodness, okay. And then it all became about whether he was gaining enough weight, and whether there was the right nutrition in my milk to help him put on weight. And he ended up being weighed every single day for the first 3 or 4 weeks of his life. Someone would come to my house and weigh him, and it was down to the 100 grams. And for someone who already had an obsession with weight and numbers and scales, it was really difficult situation.
And that speaks to what you say there about the concentration is on what's baby gaining, what is the weight, and what is the kind of well-being of baby. Are you very conscious of that, Chantelle, in terms of the research and making sure that you take on board all the voices of these women that have been through this experience, but also talking directly to the health professionals themselves, and trying to kind of make them cognizant of kind of how they're impacting on the experiences of women going through pregnancy and early motherhood?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of my main aims is to improve the knowledge out there for healthcare professionals, sorry, excuse me, for family, friends, anyone supporting mum and baby during that time. I think there are a lot of unhelpful messages that are given to women by professionals, by social media, even in books that are written about pregnancy and postpartum. And these messages often are unhelpful at the best of times, never mind for these women who are already struggling with an eating disorder. And I think, I guess breastfeeding hadn't come up much in my reading, but when I was chatting to people with sort of that lived experience in the planning stages of my research, it became clear that's a really big thing. I think that there are a lot of messages out there about breastfeeding, perhaps outdated views of it, which can really put that pressure on for women. And like you say, Abi, it can cause a lot of shame. It can almost cause people to sort of latch onto it and become a bit of an obsession. So that's definitely an area that I can anticipate coming up quite a bit in the interviews that we do.
And then, because at the end I ended up sort of doing a bit of both, and I think, I've spoken to the women who've ended up not being able to produce milk or whatever, and it is still deemed by a lot of sort of maternity healthcare professionals as a failure if you do not breastfeed. And I think for anybody who is already very vulnerable and possibly prone to pretty harsh self-criticism, that can be deeply unhelpful.
We know the traits of people often with eating disorders are about, perfectionist, people pleaser, kind of trying to attain and achieve the impossible so many times. So you add in something like breastfeeding, which so many women, whether they've been kind of ever concerned with their weight and their eating regime prior to pregnancy or not, so many women have a difficulty with breastfeeding, then, it just adds another layer, doesn't it? So where are you at then with this research, and how long can we, expect the process to be before we're sitting here seeing the sum total of what you've been able to come up with, and also your recommendations, which is ultimately, I always think research is a great thing, but sometimes, research can often be problem focused. This is the problem, it's awful, but what are we doing about it? What do we need to tell health visitors? How do we change the way that we as partners, loved ones, family members support someone through a pregnancy?
Yeah, so you raise a really important point there about it often being problem focused, and I think we're really trying to sort of get a bit of a balance there in this research. And we're really interested in speaking to women who maybe did have an eating disorder before their pregnancy, like historically, or during their pregnancy, but actually postpartum didn't experience that worsening of symptoms. We know it's very common that they do often get worse, but the research does suggest there's a small group of women who are able to continue that improvement. So we're really interested in speaking to those as well, to find out, what their circumstances were, what helped them to continue that improvement, so that we get a bit of a balance there. Your second question, where are we up to? So we've got ethics approval and we've just started recruiting. So we're currently looking for women who have experienced an eating disorder either before or during their pregnancy. And it can be any time before their pregnancy. It could be 30 years, 20 years before their pregnancy. And then they were in sort of, I guess, what would be considered recovery. And then they got pregnant and had their baby, because of the research that shows that it can be triggering for those women as well. We're looking for around 20 women to do a bit of a semi-structured interview. And by that, what we mean is the researcher, so me, who's doing the interviews, will sort of guide them to talk about specific things that the research has suggested already. However, each interview is going to look very, very different. We're really interested in getting people's own direct experience and talking about their specific circumstances. So we're expecting each one to be quite open and to gather quite a lot of different information. And then what we'll do is sort of analyse them to look for underlying themes and things that link up between them.
So 20 is a relatively low number, isn't it, for a piece of research like that? Do you think you will gain enough insight from that, or is your hope that once you can get some sense of what this tells you, you can extend it out further, perhaps?
Yeah, so I think for this type of sort of qualitative research where you're interviewing women and getting their direct experience, the numbers unfortunately have to be that low. Ideally, we would interview hundreds of women, but it's just not doable, unfortunately. There is quite a lot of what's called quantitative research, which is things like questionnaires. However, I don't feel that does this area justice. I feel like at the moment what we need is actual words, lived experiences.
And I think, Abby's a case in point there, really, isn't she? Because if you just gave Abby a survey and said tick a few boxes, you don't get that kind of sense of what did you go through, what worked, what didn't work, how low did you feel, what did this cause, and what did this link to. And so I can absolutely see why quantitative is just not in itself, in isolation, just certainly wouldn't be enough.
Yeah, and I also wonder.
Sorry. I was just going to say, so in terms of the Wednesday's Child medium, can we be of help to you then in terms of helping to find more candidates to be part of that process?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, for anyone that's listening or anyone that sort of accesses Wednesday's Child frequently or has a read of the website, if you're interested or if you've experienced this, then it would be really, really valuable to us to speak to you and to get that experience, because I think that's the only thing that's going to move us forwards in this area, to actually speak to people who have experienced this, find out exactly what it was that made their experience more difficult and exactly what it was that they feel would have helped them during that time or did help them during that time.
Okay. Well, certainly we're happy to share all the links to the research that you're doing. What's the best way of getting in touch with you, Chantelle?
So you can get me on Twitter. My username is Chantelle_Ecob, that's ECOB, or my email address. I won't read that out because it's quite long, but that will be on all the leaflets and stuff.
We'll put that in the show notes as well.
Yeah, fab. But I would really urge people to get in touch with any questions or interest or just comments, even if you don't want to take part in an interview. Any feedback or thoughts are valued. And, if you do get in touch, you're not sort of signing up to take part in an interview. You can just have a little chat with me and then make a decision afterwards.
And just because I know that, because it is such a kind of emotive area and people feel a lot of kind of shame about it, even though, of course, they shouldn't. just to check, for people that do sign up and that do these interviews and things, will their data, their information, their stories, will that all be used anonymously, or what? Just thinking about people's kind of concerns about confidentiality and things. I don't know if you could just quickly chat through what people can expect.
Yeah, of course. So all data will be anonymised 2 weeks after the interviews. There might be some direct quotes used in the final write-up, but there'll be no way at all of linking that with specific people. Names won't be used in the write-up. We are gathering demographic information like age, ethnicity, postcode, just because there might be some interesting findings that come back from that, specific patterns within age ranges or different ethnicities, but it won't be able to identify anyone specifically. And I think it's a really good point what you make about, it could be quite triggering or difficult for people to chat about this experience and to sort of take them back. So we're very conscious of that. We've got like a sort of wellbeing protocol that we're going to use to protect women's safety during the time. I'm sort of a training clinical psychologist, so the questions won't be harsh and non-empathetic. I'll do my best to make sure it's quite a nurturing environment.
Well, thank you. And we certainly wish you luck with it, Chantelle, because every bit of research into this area can only be for the greater good of what we're able to do in terms of educating and changing the way the process is experienced by other women going forward. And I would just encourage anybody, if you listen to this episode and if it's the first time for you that you've been kind of brought to mind that you want to talk about your experiences either to us or to Chantelle in terms of her research, or you want to hear a little bit more about Abi's story perhaps, and you want to get a bit more insight and understanding, or perhaps it's just prompted you to want to have that conversation with your own health visitor and put your hand up and say, actually, I don't ought to feel ashamed about this. This is where I'm at. I need somebody to pay closer attention to my health and well-being as well as to my baby. Then, I would just say, use that as an opportunity for you and make sure that you stand up and be counted for what you're going through, because nothing is right, nothing is wrong, and it is really important that you talk about it, because those suppressed emotions will give you and your baby no help in the longer term. So thank you so much, Chantelle, and to you, Abi, also for your contribution to this episode. And I'm sure we'll do a follow-up. It would be great to hear from you kind of a few months from now, just to see how the research has been going. And then perhaps Abi and I can quiz you again and to find out what you've been hearing and how you intend to progress things from that point forward. Thanks again for listening to this latest episode of the Wednesday's Child podcast. We'll be back with you again soon with more guests and some more insight. But for now, take care of you, take care of your recovery, and stay focused on overcoming your eating disorder journey.